what is trauma? Hello everyone, my name is Rich Pearson. I'm a professional counsellor and psychotherapist based in Falmouth in Cornwall, and today we're going to be talking about trauma. So when people talk about trauma, in the most basic sense, to describe trauma in a physical sense, a trauma, blunt force trauma, you would talk about something, an injury being caused of some kind. That is trauma in the sort of medical and physical kind of sense. But trauma, of course, is much more often related to the mind, the soul, the emotions, the psyche, and we talk about things like post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very real condition that affects people in a wide range of manners throughout their life. And what is interesting about trauma is that many people won't qualify what has happened to themselves as traumatic. We often think of trauma or especially things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of people will think of that and think you have to have been in a war zone to have experienced that. You have to have come under enemy fire, literally been shot at by other people to experience PTSD. And please do not get me wrong, I'm not discounting anything like that. I know guys that have served actively in the armed forces. I have my own views on war and the armed forces in itself, but it's never made me think that the people themselves that go and fight in it are any less deserving of help and respect. And it's truly terrifying what PTSD and what trauma does to people, because trauma is essentially something which hasn't healed. And in the most common psychological terms, it is something that has changed a thing, and that thing might be someone's mind, it might be someone's emotions, it might be someone's soul. It has changed a thing and has not yet been repaired. And I say yet because I like to be an optimist and think that most things can either be fixed or be made manageable. Now, when we talk about trauma, as I've said, there's this belief, I guess, that you have to have fought in a war zone, or at very least been in a car accident or something like that. Trauma can be anything. Trauma is utterly subjective. Trauma can be, doesn't even have to be physical it doesn't have to be a physical threat in order for it to be a problem. Now, I'm not going to talk about my dad too much on this channel because he's not here anymore to defend himself or anything, and I largely had a very nice upbringing in life. But my dad did shout a lot, not necessarily always at me, and I know other people who had parents who shouted quite a lot. I have to admit, I've done it once or twice with my partner as well, and I really dislike it because shouting is something that traumatized me, it turns out. It turned out that actually having my dad pretty much constantly yelling about things made me very jumpy, it made me very scared, and it makes me go into a state where I actually can't respond to things. Trauma is anything which affects a person's ability to act under normal circumstances. Now, interestingly, something which I haven't ever really been traumatized by is violence. And I'm quite happy and comfortable in situations, and I say this like it happens regularly. I can think of one example in the last 10 years of my life where I have been in a violent confrontation with someone, and it wasn't even directed at me. I remember I was in a pub and two guys started swinging at each other, and me and a friend just really calmly separated them, pushed one out one door, one out the other. I don't think my heart rate even went up. I was just like, this is fine. I don't, that, because it's very simple, it's very cut and dry, it's very, to me, it is at least. But some other people, they would see something like that happening and they would just freeze. But what happens to me is if someone shouts at me, I basically shut down. I honestly find it hard to respond and talk to people. I find it hard to articulate. I find it hard to respond or react in any way. And this is what is referred to as the fight or flight response. Now, the fight or flight response is a human kind of response that is developed through years of protecting ourselves. It's a self-interest kind of thing. However, it's something which can misfire, I guess, is a way of describing it. If we find ourselves in a situation where we have been traumatized by something and then we are triggered by that same thing later on, as you often hear in society today, people talking about being triggered, the person can have a traumatic reaction to something which was not the same as the original trauma, but it was close enough to trigger that response. And I heard a really good way of describing this once in terms of what a psychologist was trying to do with a client that they were working with. And they said their goal was to get their client to be able to remember the initial traumatic response without reliving it. And that's what trauma victims do. I've got guys, who are friends of mine who blown up in Afghanistan, and they wake up in the middle of the night screaming because they think they're still back there. That's trauma at the most commonly recognized levels. But the same thing goes on in my brain when I remember I had an ex-girlfriend who just shouted all the time, and whenever she shouted at me, I couldn't respond, and it made her more angry. And the more angry she got, the further I retreated into my place of not being able to respond to things. There's a thing called the parasympathetic nervous system, which I'm going to do another video on later on because it's a whole bigger own topic, and it really goes into detail about the fight or flight response. But simply today, talking about trauma, the message I wanted to get across is that trauma doesn't have to be something that is physically violent and something that is what everyone else would agree would be a traumatic incident. Trauma can be anything, and trauma can also be inherited. There's a famous quote that someone once said that it's entirely possible that since 1945 we have not seen an untraumatized person, which is to say that since the end of World War II, which was one of the greatest acts of trauma that possibly was, no one has been free or spared of the traumas of war. And I, in my own sense, can recognize that. My father was born on February the 18th, 1945. He was born in Wolverhampton, several months before the end of the Second World War. He grew up in a city that was rebuilding itself after years of bombing. He grew up in Coventry and Wolverhampton. He experienced a world where people were very traumatized by the simple act of existence in those years. I look at my grandparents. My grandfather was evacuated from the home counties during the war as a small child, and he was sent to North Wales because they put all these children out of the way of what they feared would be attacks from the Axis forces. My grandmother had a very traumatic time during the Second World War, and that has been passed down through my family. And because we had this very British stiff upper lip kind of thing. We don't talk about that kind of stuff. We don't worry about that kind of thing. You just push it all down. And I will go into, as I say, more detail of the parasympathetic nervous system and the common reactions that people have to trauma. But the number one thing that has been recognized, as far as I can tell, better than any medication, better than any kind of electroshock therapy or anything like that, that has helped people who have been suffering from trauma, is to talk about it. It is the number one thing that has helped people to get over their traumatic instances. And sometimes that's very scary, because sometimes it does mean going back and reliving that traumatic situation and better understanding it. And like how I talked about being overwhelmed before, being able to put a name to something gives you some kind of mastery over it. Being able to talk about something, being able to bring something into the light, as we sometimes call it in counselling, being able to bring something into the room and process it and say, this is this thing. I'm in charge of it, I understand it, and letting that be the thing that makes you in control again. So I hope you've enjoyed this relatively brief video on what explanations of trauma can be. If you'd like to see more stuff like this, please feel free to subscribe, and I will see you all next time for the next video, which I don't know what it'll be on yet, but I'll figure it out from there. Thanks very much. See you all next time.